for joining us for the Passive House Summit presented by Passive House Accelerator. We're super excited that you're here with us today. And my name is Zach Semke, and I'm director of Passive House Accelerator. Passive House Accelerator is a collaborative online platform for sharing innovation and thought leadership in passive house design and construction. We publish articles and interviews. We produce weekly virtual confabs with passive house pioneers from around the world. And we elevate the work and programming of the passive house movement's leaders, practitioners, and organizations through interviews, articles, social media campaigns, video, and podcasts. Our aim is to catalyze zero carbon building by accelerating the adoption of passive house building. If you're new to passive house, we do have a primer on passive house on our new website. If you go to the Passive House 101 section, you can drop down there and see that there's some basic information about passive house, its benefits, its standards, as well as an introduction to passive house design principles. So please check that out. Every week, I'm going to mention a couple of events that are coming up as folks join us. We have a big crowd tonight. Every week, we present a Construction Tech Tuesday on Tuesday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Tomorrow's Construction Tech will feature the team from Monadnock Construction, presenting about a multifamily passive house project in New York that you can see there. They'll be looking at the technical, the technique, and the technology of the construction of this building. On Wednesday, every Wednesday, we hold a Global Passive House Happy Hour. This happy hour will feature Zaina Talia, who will be presenting about developing passive house and net zero condos. And then we also do a podcast every week, a podcast episode. And this podcast episode features Robin Wark this week of BC Hydro, and she's on the panel tonight. So you'll get to meet her and other great leaders tonight. I want to give a big shout out to the organizations that make Passive House Accelerators work possible. We wouldn't be able to do any of this without support from our sponsors. So thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxtingwe Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, Rockwool, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Also, a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA. And thank you to our patron sponsors, Aero Barrier, BR+A Consulting Engineers, Brennan Airtightness and Insulation, Innotech Windows and Doors, and US Engineered Wood T-Stud. Big shout out to those sponsors for their support. I also want to remind everyone and acknowledge that this entire conversation we're having about policy is thanks to the good work of organizations like these. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I want to just acknowledge and thank these organizations for the great work they've done to spur on the policy progress that we'll be celebrating and sharing tonight. So thank you to Passive House Canada for their work on the BC Step Code, for example, and to Passive House Institute, Passive House Institute US, NAPHN, IFA, and others for lots of policy progress around North America and the world. We're also going to be talking about and engaging with questions around equity. And this is a movement or a trend that's happening throughout the Passive House community and really all sectors of society now, thankfully. So NAPHN is their conference is coming up in June. Is entitled Passive House for All, and it will focus on comfort, health, equity, and security. So we appreciate that leadership. If you're interested in seeking out information and learning around centering equity in your work around Passive House, a great resource is NAACP's Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector. And I know that Ken Levinson from NAPHN, Mary Rogero from FIAS, and Johnny Rizvani from 475 are all engaged in the ongoing meetings of this group. But there's a lot, so you can join in that, or you can also draw on the resources that are available on this website here. I want to acknowledge that, I want to first say that it's our goal to elevate and feature BIPOC voices on the events that we do. So Black, Indigenous, and people of color voices in our events. And we fell short in recruiting Black leaders to this particular panel. We did reach out to Black leaders in New York City, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the District of Columbia, but we were not successful. So we'll keep on working on this. It's clear to us that our network, we need to be broadening and deepening our network so that we can be successful at this in the future. All right, so let's move on to the program here. And I put together a kind of visual depiction of the program that represents our understanding as we were organizing the summit of the three legs of the stool for successful passive house policy. So we have raising the floor through code progress, setting the ceiling through emissions caps, and rewarding early adoption through incentives. So the way that tonight is going to go is we'll start with some framing by Bomi Jung, who I'm about to introduce. Then we'll move into the presentations about code progress. So the BC step code by Robin Wark, a presentation by Mike Fowler about scrappy progress in Washington. Anthony Pack will talk about embodied carbon policy that's bubbling up in Vancouver. Then we'll move to setting the ceiling and emissions caps with NYC Local Law 97 presented by Tom Isley. And then we'll move over to incentives. So that will be a presentation by Bev Craig about progress at Mass CEC and Mass Save and other programs in Massachusetts. Prudence Ferreira will then talk about ASHRAE 227, and that's providing a potential tool for all three legs of the stool. And then Bomi will come back to sum it up. So this is we're looking at fast-paced presentations by these panelists, followed by questions and answers. So I will be the Q&A concierge today. So as you have questions during the program, please pose them in chat, and I will be tracking those and keeping track of those. And time permitting, I'll invite you to ask the question on camera, on Zoom, of the panelists yourself. So we're going to dive into the panelists now, and then go into questions and answers after. So I'm going to move into introducing Bomi Jung. For more than 17 years, Bomi has contributed to New York City's climate leadership through policy and programmatic innovations. At the New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA, the largest apartment owner in the US, she led the development and implementation of public housing's most ambitious 10-year strategic sustainability plan. Highlights include a $700 million program of energy performance contracts, a $300 million heat and hot water electrification program, a 25 megawatt community solar program, and the city's first new nomadic waste collection system in 47 years. Prior to NYCHA, she designed and led the climate mitigation and adaptation programs of the New York City Office of Enterprise Community Partners, a national leader in green affordable housing. Bomi holds a master in city planning degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and serves on the boards of New York Passive House and the Institute for Market Transformation. And with that, Bomi, please take it away.
Thank you, Zach, for bringing us together for this event. When I was posting on LinkedIn this morning, I was like, it's going to be jam-packed. And I really think it is going to be really jam-packed. So very exciting. So my job tonight is to set the scene in this slightly unusual way. I think that when we have these conversations about code, it's often very, very serious and very, very technical. And my job is to actually, as we go into celebrating these important policy victories and models, I'm going to ask the audience to listen really actively with these two questions in mind. The first question is, what role does Passive House play in climate justice? And the second question is, how do we center climate justice in building performance policy? So I'd like to start you off by offering you this definition of climate justice. Climate justice is the principle that actions to mitigate and adapt to climate change should, number one, equitably distribute their benefits, redress existing inequities, and dismantle institutional racism. I want to just highlight that when we're talking about climate justice, it's not just about harm mitigation. So it's not just about don't site that waste transfer station next to this low-income neighborhood, or don't put that peaker plant there. It's not just that historically marginalized communities should be better off. What we're saying is that both the process and the outcomes ought to be restorative and strive to achieve the absolute outcomes of health, dignity, and the pursuit of fulfillment. So this is not a relative exercise. This is an absolute exercise, right? So this is a little abstract and a little even heady. So let me give you my perspective on this as a person who's been working in housing. So I've been working at the intersection of affordable housing and climate change. And from my perspective, one way I see passive house intersecting with climate justice, and surely there are many interactions, is really about discussion about quality. Because from time to time throughout the history of affordable housing, we've redefined what we consider to be acceptable housing conditions. And I think it's clear to all of us on this panel and probably in the audience that passive house buildings are the best buildings that we know how to build today, not only because they're energy efficient, but because they deliver the best occupant experience as well. So when we say all new construction or all affordable housing should be built to passive house today, that's not just a statement about efficiency. What we're saying is it is a restorative approach to housing, because what we're asking folks to do is to build the best building we know how to build for the people who have most suffered from disinvestment. So I also want to leave you with this other thought about climate justice, which is that climate justice is not just about restorative outcomes, it's equally about the process, right? So climate justice says that in order to understand what is restorative, the people most affected have to have real decision-making power. Before I went into urban planning, I was a computer programmer during sort of the heyday of the open source movement. So to borrow some words from Richard Stallman of the open source movement, climate justice is free, not as in beer, but as in speech. So yes, the outcomes are great, right? Yes, the improvements are great, but it doesn't end in the building product that we produce, but it's about giving folks agency. It's about giving them the freedom to make those decisions and co-create with us. So with that thought, I'd like to hand it back to Zach.
Thank you, Bomi. That was incredible. Okay, so we're going to now dive into BC step code with Robin Wark. So Robin, feel free to start getting your slides together as I introduce you to the audience here. Robin is manager of advanced demand side management at BC Hydro, which builds partnerships to advance low carbon communities through codes, standards, and smart innovative solutions. She has co-created numerous peer networks, innovation labs, and councils to bring partners together to solve sustainability challenges. Current leadership positions include Vice Chair of the BC Energy Step Code Council, Treasurer of the Community Energy Association, and Steering Committee for the BC Building Electrification Roadmap. Her work has won awards from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the Canadian Institute of Planners, and the Real Estate Foundation of BC. In 2013, she was awarded the Individual Award for Leadership in Advocacy and Innovation from the Planning Institute of British Columbia. Robin has been a mentor within the C40 Women for Climate program since 2019. She's our featured guest on the podcast this week, and we're very happy to have her here to present.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this event today. It's really exciting to hang out virtually with so many great people. So I'm going to be talking about lessons from the BC Energy Step Code. This is the front cover of a report that we wrote a couple of years ago, sharing our reflections on our journey to get the Energy Step Code into place. And then as an opportunity to be able to discuss and share lessons across the world. So here's some slides. I'm just going to start with a couple of slides that an industry leader put together. And I don't know, I like Mad Men. I don't know about you guys, but this is how he started his presentation. By 2032, every BC builder will face a simple choice. build like Passive House, or build somewhere else. Are you ready? And we really, I mean, setting that tone within industry conversations has been really empowering in BC. We're in the midst of a real market transformation where we're seeing thousands and thousands of new buildings getting built to different levels of the Energy Step Code. So every different types of building type, all different parts of the province, some referencing the top step like Passive House, some lower down, but all getting built above code. In Vancouver, we've got this top step of step code, we've got Passive House, we've got over 360,000 square feet of new development, new Passive House construction underway. Here's an example of the largest Passive House certified building in Canada. That's in the city of Surrey. And from a social housing perspective, BC Housing, our social housing provider, has been a complete leader in both designing the step code with us and then rolling that out. So we see over 3,500 social housing units have been built already to the step code, with another 6,000 currently under permit or under construction. The question that Zach asked in putting this together was, what problem did we try and solve by putting together the Energy Step Code? So on our reflections, we had found, so I work for an energy utility which works in partnership with government and builders to be able to build above code. And we do work on code development, but we typically find that code development can be incremental in nature. So we know, for example, that we can already build really very efficient buildings like the Passive House buildings that many of you are involved in. And yet code updates never seem to meet those standards that we know we can build to. They just kind of inch up over time. There are a whole bunch of above code standards that people can reference, but I'm not a very technical person, and I found it really confusing. Like, how does Passive House match up with Energy Star or Built Green or LEED? Or so it's really confusing in the incentive marketplace. If local government's trying to reference things, what they should be referring to. So our approach in BC has been to set that end game and then backcast what we need to be doing to get from there to here. Sorry, from here to there. So we did a white paper and determined that we could change the industry to get to passive level by 2032. So maybe we could have been more ambitious, but that was the date that we set for ourselves. And then we backcast and said, well, where are we now, which was in 2015? And then what steps do we need to get to in order to get to that level of all buildings being net zero energy ready or passive house by 2032? And then how can we work in the interim, not just in cranking the code up, but to be working on training and support to build industry capacity to all of those steps in order to get to that top level. Our idea was to bring order to the chaos of all these different building standards and instead lock it into a framework that we could use here in BC. So we have different steps for the different building types. This is for the small homes, so Part 9 buildings here in BC. And so this is a framework where we've got everything. The base building code is going to be passive level in 2032. And then we've got these different steps, which are various levels better than code. And then we've got dates. So in 2022, when the code changes, it will go to step 3. 2027 will be step 4. And then 2032, it will go to that passive level. Now, the trick of writing a code that goes to those performance standards is that it's a performance-based code. Writing prescriptive requirements to achieve all these different outcomes in all different building types is very complicated. So instead, we've used a performance-based approach with air modeling, energy modeling up front, sorry, and then air tightness testing at the end of construction to ensure that you've got a quality envelope. It's a really envelope first solution. You've got to get that envelope in place in a really solid way and then put efficient equipment inside it. So this is what, so you imagine like our code before looks like, I don't know, 130 pages, really complicated. This is a table that we put into the BC building code, which articulates what the standards are for air tightness, building enclosure, and then equipment and systems. Now, the other secret of what we did here in BC is that one of the challenges of getting provincial codes in place, or state codes, perhaps in other jurisdictions, is that it has to be achievable in every single community in your jurisdiction. And that's challenging for some of the more remote, smaller community with less sophisticated builders. So what we did in BC was allowed our leading local or any local government who wanted to follow the guidance to be able to refer to above levels of code, so different levels of the step code. And so it was largely large communities. So we as a utility support staff within some of the larger communities here in BC, but it also could be like a champion community. Like maybe you've got a building official out in Kimberley, a small city who's a small town who's really, really keen and can really handhold the builders through that. So we were seeing that by allowing local governments to go at their own pace up these steps, we saw a much faster adoption. So within 12 months of the step code being made available to local governments, we had, I think, about 10 or 15 local governments who'd adopt it, which meant that over 50% of all building permits reference the step code. So now we're in 2021, we've got about 75% of all building permits reference the step code, which means that when the provincial code comes in and locks that in 2022, it's just dealing with that extra 25% of building permits. So it really helps with that market transformation. And then those local governments who started a few years ago are now referencing higher and higher levels of the step code in order to ready industry to move up through those levels to hit that 2032 target. That's the end of my presentation on the step code. But our story doesn't end here at all. Obviously, we need to make sure that the code get locked in 2022 and 2027. We have two particular challenges we're now working with. The first one is that our code refers to energy efficiency. It doesn't talk about carbon metrics. And we've done studies to show that if we just look at energy efficiency, we're not going to meet our climate targets or our Clean BC plan targets that we have here in BC. So local governments, BC Housing, the affordable housing provider here in BC, have all been using GHGI or greenhouse gas metric, intensity metric to lock in as well as energy efficiency. So we're currently seeing how we can get that locked into the step code. And then the other even bigger challenge is existing buildings. And what can we do to provide a step code or an alteration code for existing buildings? And that's where we're looking over at best practices elsewhere, globally and in North America. So I'm super excited to hear what Tom has to say, because we're always referring to the New York model and when we're planning what we should be doing in that existing building space. And we're seeing City of Vancouver, Metro Vancouver already referencing that New York approach. So thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm really excited to hear what everybody else has to share as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robin. We've got some good questions for you for the Q&A section too. So we're going to move on now to Mike Fowler, who will be talking about the scrappy, stealthy work that he's been doing in Washington State. So Mike Fowler brings 30 years of experience in his role as the Sustainability Integration Leader in the Seattle office of Mithun. He engages on all firm projects, including a 330,000 square foot graduate student housing project seeking FIAS Plus 2021 certification. Outside of the office, Mike is the board president of Passive House Northwest. And on behalf of the American Institute of Architects Washington Council, he represents architects on the State Energy Code Technical Advisory Group. Mike, please take it away.
Right, thank you, Zach, and thank you, Passive House Accelerator, for providing this opportunity to share our Passive House Northwest story with you about our process, research, presentations, and policy efforts here in Washington State. I say I love the premise statement for this policy summit. All new buildings can and should be Passive House buildings right now. And we did not have this bold accelerator statement when Passive House Northwest thought about becoming a player in the policy game back in 2017, but we were thinking along similar lines. Our goal became this: to create an energy code pathway for all new multifamily buildings to meet the PHI low energy building standard. A typical code cycle brings small incremental steps of improvement represented by the blue arrow. Getting to a Passive House certification level overnight, the yellow arrow, while technically feasible, seemed too high of a wall to scale for us in just one jump. pushing to the low energy building standard felt attainable for getting our state to a passive house certification point. And if it proved successful, it would move our energy code from sitting 4 code cycle blocks down the street to standing right on the doorstep, ready to knock on the door to a full PHI or FIAS certification. Just a quick side note, FIAS plus 2015 standard ranged from 4.9 to 6.4 for heating demand, depending on the location. EnerFit ranges from 6.3 to 7.9, depending on where in our climate zone for the state. And at one point, I did have a slide that showed all 4 of these together, but it's just too much information in one place. I'm going to spare you the deep dive into the 20-some individual measures that were modeled on a 4-story and 10-story multifamily prototype buildings. But the takeaway was clear. There is no individual measures that by themselves come anywhere close to meeting our target heating demand. And just a quick note to help folks calibrate, our commercial code uses CFM 75, our residential code uses ACH 50. Our current commercial code at 0.40 CFM 75 is approximately 2 ACH 50. The Army Corps of Engineers standard at 0.25 is 1.2 ACH, and the FIAS 0.08 standard is 0.4 ACH. So what did work was a combination of air tightness, heat recovery ventilation, and insulation. So that's no big surprise for folks who know Passive House. And at this point, I started sharing the model results with a friendly stakeholder group. The group seemed quite okay with the additional cost of $1,400 for each unit, which would be recovered by energy savings in about 5 years. The big surprise came from an affordable housing rep who expressed extreme concern and would not support the proposal when I mentioned the performance met the PHI low energy building level. This friendly group also suggested breaking this package up into individual proposals. Air tightness by itself could pass, but the heat recovery ventilation was just doomed to certain failure. So I did listen to that group, but decided to keep everything bundled. Certainly a risky move in code proposals, but we were going for low energy building status and not incremental. Note that I did drop the insulation from the package, which meant I could go back and accurately tell the affordable housing rep the proposal was no longer at a PHI level, and that did gain their public support. What I kept to myself was that a similar insulation proposal was very likely coming from some other organization. So beyond the geeky model numbers, there were 2 things that really jazzed me up about this proposal. First one was balanced heat recovery ventilation. This is, to me, is a big win because it means eliminating trickle vents from window frames, because this is not ventilation. The second was air tightness. Leaky buildings, they just irritate me. The fact that air can leak in from joint cracks and be called makeup air is it's just not right. To emphasize this point, I'm going to do something a little bit unconventional in the presentation, and I'm going to quote myself from 2015, but hopefully it explains why I feel air tightness is so important for indoor air quality. Now, if I feel like I need fresh air, I do not want to get down on my hands and knees to snort a line of air along the top of the baseboard trim. With our research and outreach complete, it was now go time for presenting this to the State Energy Code Technical Advisory Group. I introduced this as a proposal from Passive House Northwest and never mentioned Passive House again. I emphasize that if you set a standard, the industry will learn to meet it. And in this RDH report, more than 3/4 of the buildings tested met the Army Corps of Engineers standard. And building tests in Washington State were also showing the ability to meet this standard. Option air tightness level that was proposed was also achievable. This Walsh construction list shows a dozen buildings they have hitting and exceeding the mark down to 0.012 CFM 75. I emphasize that mechanical ventilation is absolutely essential for multifamily buildings. In this RDH study of a 6-story building with trickle vents, the upper 3 floors consistently are above the ASHRAE standard for CO2 concentrations. And when you overlay the Harvard School Public District Health Study, 2 of the 3 lower levels were typically above a level corresponding to a 50% reduction in cognitive function. And then another 2 floors, while they did meet the ASHRAE standard, had CO2 levels corresponding to a 15% reduction in cognitive ability. So what the combination of excellent air tightness and balanced mechanical ventilation does is provide exact control over where air is coming from. And a study from Stephen Winter Associates shows that turning on an exhaust fan in an airtight building creates a pressure response. When a door is opened, the pressure drops in stage 4, and we know air is coming in through the door. The same situation in the building that was around our current code air tightness, when the exhaust fan is turned on, and there's essentially no pressure drop happening. And when the door is open, there's minimal pressure drop. So this means air could be coming in through the door, and it just means it could also be leaking in from holes elsewhere in the building. And a real life example of this is when I was punch listing one of our affordable multifamily projects in California with the client's maintenance manager. In one unit, I reach in to turn on the light in the bathroom, which is right across the entry hall from the kitchen, when at the same time he's turning on the kitchen exhaust fan. And air blew across my hand. And I yelled over, "Turn off the fan, turn off the fan." And so following a very strange look, he turns off the fan and the air stops blowing across my hand. And then I'm like, "Turn it back on, turn it back on." And again, air blows across my hand from the light switch. So we traded places so I could show that I was not completely insane. And when air blew across his hand, the stunned amazement and his burst out of laughter was just priceless. So on the other side of this open living space, about 20 feet away, there's an open Z duct in the exterior wall where outdoor air is supposed to come in from, but instead, air was leaking in around the light switch. So now I need to update my baseboard line. So, hey babe, you okay there? Yeah, I'm fine. Just getting a little fresh air from the light switch. Healthy indoor air is a basic human right. This was stated by the World Health Organization in 2000. I ended this Energy Code Technical Advisory Group summary presentation that this proposal was achievable right now. It improved the comfort and health of our fellow citizens. It was extremely cost effective and provided excellent energy savings. And I concluded with that this proposal was an essential next step for the state on its path to meet the required 70% reduction in energy use by our 2030 code when compared to the 2006 code. This proposal did pass the technical advisory group as it was written, bundled together. I ran into a little opposition at the final state code council hearing, but it survived. And after 2 implementation delays, our 2018 energy code went into effect on February 1st this year. So that separate insulation measure did get proposed and did pass, and that effectively completed our Passive House Northwest proposal. So what is not well known is that the multifamily prototype models do show that heating demand is low enough to meet the low energy building standard in the prototype models. It gets even better when you up the heat recovery to above 80%, if you select that as one of your required 6 option points. So just a note to say that I want to emphasize that this is not a prescriptive approach. It does not guarantee every multifamily building will meet the low energy building standard. Teams still need to select the air tightness option, model their buildings, and make smart decisions to meet all parts of the standard. And just one quick note about Shift Zero in our area. This is a coalition that was co-founded by the Northwest Eco Building Guild, AIA Seattle, and Passive House Northwest, with the idea that environmental organizations should stop fighting with each other and instead work together toward creating a zero carbon built environment. So now we have over 45 organizations in this coalition. And just 1 year later, when the proposals were due for changing the state residential energy code, Shift Zero made this proposal to the state to list PHI and FIA certification as one of the energy code compliance tasks. And this is now also code in Washington state. To the end, there is no substitution for being in the room where it happens. Just suggest work to get yourself and your allies into the room, making those new proposals, get yourself appointed to boards and committees, and become part of those folks in the room who do make decisions and give approvals. So with that, thank you, Passive House Accelerator. It's been a pleasure to share our Passive House Northwest story with you and our persistence and under the radar proposal to create a path for all multifamily buildings in the state to meet the Passive House low energy building performance level. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you, Mike. That was fantastic, and it's a great reminder about your sense of humor as well. That was hilarious. All right, we're going to move and pivot to Anthony Pack, and a little change from operational carbon to embodied carbon. So Anthony is the principal at Preopta, a leading firm with deep expertise in life cycle assessment for buildings. Preopta empowers architects and engineers with the data knowledge they need to reduce embodied carbon. Anthony is also the founder of CLF Vancouver, the first local hub of the Carbon Leadership Forum, which organizes local events that empower industry professionals to radically reduce embodied carbon from buildings and infrastructure. Since 2019, CLF Vancouver has inspired over 25 other cities to start CLF local hubs. So now Anthony also serves as the CLF Regional Hub Director, supporting local hubs across Western North America and Asia Pacific. He's a professional engineer with a master's in industrial ecology from NTNU, which is a leading LCA lifecycle assessment research group in Norway. With that, Anthony, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Zach. Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about the embodied carbon policy in Vancouver. So most of the other panelists are going to be talking about operational carbon emissions and passive house. I'm talking about the other half of the equation, which is embodied carbon. And so that refers to the emissions associated with construction materials. So think of all the concrete, steel, glass, insulation, all those materials that go into the building. We basically quantify the carbon emissions across all the different life cycle stages. So from cradle to grave, everything from resource extraction, transportation, manufacturing, construction, operation, all the way to end of life. Now, here's a kind of a representation over a typical lifespan of a building. So let's say it lasts 60 years. These yellow bars represent the operational carbon emissions to heat and cool and operate the building each year. And that's historically what we use energy modeling and things like PHBP to quantify those emissions during the design phase. And as an analogy to that is a life cycle assessment for quantifying embodied carbon. So embodied carbon refers to, all the emissions from the construction materials, right? So upfront, before the building is in operation, there's a big pulse of embodied carbon emissions. But also, if there's certain building components that need to be replaced or maintained throughout the lifespan, we also account for that, as well as any emissions at end of life. And so you really need both pieces of this to get a holistic. Now, historically, the thinking has been that operational carbon emissions are far more significant than embodied carbon. So maybe we don't even need to look at it. Maybe embodied carbon is so small, maybe it's 10, 20% of the whole life carbon emissions. So maybe it's we can ignore it. But what we're seeing is that as we design buildings that are more and more energy efficient, that we're designing towards passive house levels, and also we decarbonize our electricity grid, the operational carbon emissions decreases over time. And specifically in the BC context, that's definitely where we're at, where we're getting so low on the operational carbon emissions that the embodied carbon can become a much bigger slice of a smaller pie. So let's throw some metrics here. Robin was mentioning about the BC Energy Step Code, which mainly focuses on the energy related aspects. But there was a study done by Integral Group a couple of years ago that was looking at the greenhouse gas intensity limits. So each year, to operate the different buildings at different steps along the BC Energy Step Code. You can see as you get higher in the steps, you get lower emissions, but also there's big differences in the source. So like, is it from electric heat pump, electric resistance, which are all below, let's say like 1 to 2 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared per year. And that's very, very low, right? Whereas like the gas or hybrid systems may be in the 4 to 13 range. And also, we have the Building Benchmark BC report that recently got released. So we have the first year where we've quantified and actually measured greenhouse gas intensity emissions for many of the, I think 500 plus buildings, or I think it's 700 plus buildings in BC. And the multi-unit residential building average is around 21, office is around 15. So it gives you a sense of like, this is what a typical building is maybe, and then this is what step code might bring it down to. That gives you a frame of reference for how to compare that to embodied carbon. So these are two different benchmarks. On the left-hand side, this is the Carbon Leadership Forum. A couple of years ago, they did, back in 2017, they compiled over 1,000 life cycle assessment studies, whole buildings, from around the world. And you can see there's a big range, anywhere from below 100 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared up to 1,000 or even higher, with many of them in the 200 to 600 range. Similarly, One Click LCA, which is a software provider in Europe, they've also got almost 1,000 buildings in their benchmark set, and they've created this letter grade rating system. So for different building types, if it's below 200, that's considered quite good. If it's above 800, that's really high. So that gives you kind of a rough order of magnitude. So if we pull these two pieces together, this is a current project that I'm working on, so these are just preliminary results. But as an example, for the baseline building for this building, 5-story office building, is around 558 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. And if you compare that to different operational metrics over 60 years of operation, if you have the measured GHGI numbers that I showed you earlier, then embodied is about 40%, 60% for the operation. But if you actually look at the actual building that we're working on right now, based on the energy modeling results, which is an electric building, we've gotten the operational emissions so low that it's 1.1 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. So you can see then the embodied carbon becomes 90% of the total emissions. So it dominates. So that's kind of the background context for why Vancouver is looking at embodied emissions, because it's quite significant. Now, back in 2017, they had the rezoning requirement, green building policy for rezonings, which accounts for about half of the new construction in the city. And they have various different compliance pathways. And most of the pathways actually require you to quantify and disclose the LCA results for your building at the rezoning stage, and then updating it at building permit, and then finally at occupancy. So at this stage, they weren't requiring any reductions. They just want disclosure. Interestingly enough, actually, one of the pathways that doesn't require you to quantify embodied carbon was the passive house pathway. So that's just a little quirk, but for some of these other certifications, they may be optional or they're required for quantifying, but most of the projects did require this, and that helped build up a lot of industry capacity in the city, and I think that's a crucial piece. Now, fast forward a bit, back in 2019, the city declared a climate emergency, and so they created the Climate Emergency Action Plan, whereby the city of Vancouver is targeting a 50% reduction by 2030. How do they get there? It involves 6 big moves, and one of them is focused on embodied carbon. And that big move number 5 is states that by 2030, the embodied emissions in new buildings and construction projects will be reduced by 40% compared to a 2018 baseline. And this, to my knowledge, is probably the most ambitious embodied carbon policy in North America. And it's probably right up there relative to the rest of the world. So this is what the rollout of the plan looks like right now. In this year, they're going to update the rezoning requirement. So they're likely going to require at least a 10% reduction in embodied carbon. They haven't disclosed the results for that yet, or what the requirement will be, but it'll be at least 10%. And the general strategy is to have the rezoning requirement lead the building code by about 5 years. So do the ambitious stuff on the rezoning side. So for example, we're going to go at least 10% on the rezoning this year. And then in 2025, they'll update the rezoning requirement, probably bring it more in line with the 40% target. But also at that point, they'll also then have the building code adopt the previous 2021 rezoning requirement. So if we say if it's 10 or 15% this round, in 2025, that'll kind of filter through to the rest of the code. And then by 2030, they'll bring it all in line, and the rezoning will be pushed up even above 40%. So that's kind of a high level overview of where the plan's going. And just the overarching strategy for embodied carbon really focuses on changing the rules, changing the culture, the market, and the context. So the rules, that's basically what I was just speaking about right there. Having a performance requirement, requiring projects to do whole building LCAs and demonstrate a certain percentage reduction relative to a baseline. And they're also looking at how to support, change the culture. And that involves, for example, how do we support other organizations, support events and knowledge sharing networks, such as CLF Vancouver and others like ZEBEX, and also funding tools and training, advocating with other organizations and other governments to also address embodied carbon, and also having an increased focus and attention towards supporting marginalized people in the building industry, including women and Indigenous and racialized people, and among others. They're also going to look at how to change the market. So, for example, making it easier to build with mass timber, removing barriers to that, and also making it less expensive, potentially integrating it with existing incentive programs, and also looking at where there's potential to look at complementary strategies that the city is also focusing on outside of the embodied carbon domain. So, for example, can we address the zoning requirements that reduce the underground parking, which reduces the amount of concrete in our parking structures? So that's kind of a high level overview of Vancouver's approach to embodied carbon. I just want to throw in one last note is that I see a lot of policy work happening in the US right now on embodied carbon, and much of it focuses on the individual material level. So these buy clean policies like Buy Clean California or Washington, looking at environmental product declarations of individual materials and regulating at that level. I would also really advocate for putting in policies at the asset level. So like at a whole building level, doing, looking across all the materials in a building, not just like specific to concrete or steel or whatnot. And that's it for me. Thanks.
Oh, Anthony, thank you. That was awesome. And I think we've all been absorbing some amazing rapid fire information, and we're going to continue to do so. So I want to take this moment to bring back the context of the three-legged stool, because we're about to move from one leg to another leg. So we were just talking about raising the floor through code progress, both on operational and embodied carbon fronts. Now we're going to switch over to setting the ceiling, so emissions caps, and we're going to be looking at the New York City Local Law 97 with Tom Isley. So Tom is a resiliency and sustainability consultant in New York City and Miami, Florida, with over 37 years of professional experience on building and planning projects around the world. From 2010 to 2019, Tom was senior policy advisor in the New York City Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability and the Mayor's Office of Resiliency. He was drafting local laws amending the city's construction codes, zoning resolution, and environmental regulations. Tom also created workforce development programs and policies addressing environmental justice. He has acted as principal drafter of over 60 local laws. He worked with the Mayor's Office of Sustainability to develop methodologies for tracking building energy consumption and establish metrics for this purpose, including the targets for mandated greenhouse gas emissions caps for buildings as part of the city's Climate Mobilization Act. After Hurricane Sandy, Tom worked with the city's Department of Buildings on updates to flood-resistant construction requirements of the New York City Building Code. He also served on the technical review committee in the city's Housing Recovery Office to help homeowners rebuild after the disaster. And he's policy advisor with New York Passive House. So with that, Tom, you're up.
Thanks, Zach. Hi, everybody. Appreciate you all coming out to this. So exactly 2 years ago, New York City passed what is called the Climate Mobilization Act, which is a group of 6 local laws intended to advance New York City's climate resilience and keep the promise of the Paris Agreement. So among that group of 6 laws was Local Law 97, which established greenhouse gas emissions caps or greenhouse gas emissions limits or budget for all buildings that's existing and new construction for all buildings over 25,000 square feet. Besides establishing the limits, this local law also created a Department of Buildings Office of Building Energy and Emissions Performance, OBEEP for short. You always have to have a great acronym. It helps get your program going better. The law also convenes an advisory board of stakeholders as well as agency folks to review the law's progress, opine on rulemaking around that local law, and then propose future limits. It also, the law requires a study for establishing a carbon trading strategy and then a mechanism for implementing carbon trading as part of maintaining our greenhouse gas emissions limits. On top of that, it sets requirements for the city's own portfolio of buildings, which is more portfolio wide rather than individual building level, and creating strategies for New York City's affordable housing and the New York City Housing Authority. If we look at greenhouse gas intensity from about 2016, we see the targets, we see the energy consumption or emissions for the worst percentile of buildings in the city on the left down to the best 1 percentile, the best first percentile on the right. And in order to make this law feasible, we've established initial targets that can be accommodated or are already implementable or feasible by the lion's share of existing buildings in the city. And that first reporting period is in 2024. Then in 2030, the target limits get adjusted, the screws get tightened and ratcheted down, and we start to see that a larger swath of the buildings of the city's built environment may have to do something, or not just going to be copacetic in their current condition. And then by 2050, the screws get tightened actually 2 more times, and the lion's share, pretty much all buildings in the city, will have to do something in the way of upgrades to comply with the law. So each building, each property has a greenhouse gas emissions budget that is based on its occupancy. So based on that occupancy classification in the building code, there is a factor that it gets applied in terms of number of metric tons equivalent of carbon per square foot of that building, depending on what type it is, whether it's an office building, a school, a hospital, a multifamily apartment building, and so forth. There are different factors that come up with that greenhouse gas budget. Design professional is required to calculate that emissions limit or that emissions budget and report that to the Department of Buildings. This is going to be done on an annual basis. So you have, the building has to track its energy consumption and do this greenhouse gas calculation every year and report it to the Department of Buildings. And if a building exceeds its greenhouse gas emissions budget, there is a penalty that is assessed to the building. And it's a pretty significant ding on the order of $268 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent that the building is over its greenhouse gas budget. So here's a typical example. A building that's greenhouse gas emissions budget based on its occupancy and its size would have an annual GHG budget of 935 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Based on its energy bills, it's actually producing 1,630 metric tons equivalent. So that's a pretty, now you're looking at a 6-figure penalty for that building for exceeding its GHG budget. Now, the thing to notice about that's annually. That's not once and it sits there. The building has to report every year, and for every year that building is above its GHG limit, that fine gets imposed. So that dollar amount is very impactful and can run into some serious money in a hurry if a building is not being a good citizen. The city has created via an NYU CUSP program, a dashboard, an online dashboard that anybody has access to. And you can go to this and plug in your building's address and see a number of things. It's actual EUI, and if it has an Energy Star score, which now most buildings must have, based on another New York City law, you can get the Energy Star score for that building, its water use intensity, and its greenhouse gas emissions intensity. And just through the dashboard, you can actually see, how's my building stack up vis-a-vis its 2024 first reporting year? Am I within my budget or not? And then going out to 2030, when the screws get tightened, how do I sit? Am I going to really have to start planning for some retrofits to make sure my building is in compliance? The law, here's this timeline. The carbon study, carbon trading study is underway. The advisory board has convened and has been meeting. OBEEP has a base staff and is looking to add resources and is gearing up in anticipation of 2024 and the actual 2025 reporting year. There is a deadline, there's an allowance in the law for a request by an individual property for a variance based on its circumstances. And the deadline for variance requests on its GHG limits is due probably around the middle of the year. I forget the actual date, but that's coming up pretty quickly. There's a rulemaking process that's underway that'll take at least another 2 years probably to come about, which is a bit of an irony to me, in that we pass a local law And a lot of people assume that if a law passes, the program is set up, all the mechanisms are in place, the resources are available, when the reality is that laws are very often aspirational. And it takes a bit of time for the actual implementers of a local law or requirement to get the team together, to get the resources in place, to bring it about, bring about full implementation. And then, as I said, in 2030, the limits are going to get adjusted again, so the screws are going to get tightened. So some key points. This applies to New York City. Actually has over 1 million buildings that exist already. But given setting the bar, at least for the moment, at large buildings, which are the lower hanging fruit of 25,000 square feet and larger, this applies to about 50,000 buildings across New York City. As I said, the limits are based on building occupancy. And based on the calculus, the anticipation is that we'll get a 40% cumulative reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from buildings across the city by 2030. There are two other things to note. Affordable housing or subsidized housing is not subject to these greenhouse gas emissions limits. Ironically, the environmental justice folks really pushed back against this law. Even, actually they did two things. They said the law wasn't aggressive enough, and then they said they wanted a carve out for affordable housing, which is approximately, actually, in terms of multifamily housing in New York City, affordable housing is approximately 40% of the total housing stock in New York City. So the law has already been amended, and this carve out for affordable housing is only for buildings that are 35% or greater in the number of units in the building that are subsidized or affordable. And if you're in that carve out, you don't have to meet the GHG limits, but you do have to comply with a prescriptive package of energy savings retrofits. So back to Mike Fowler's stealthy way of getting at the same thing. And now for me, the biggest thing about Local Law 97 is that this is a move, a fundamental paradigm shift from design, what I call design promises. We have codes that require us to design our buildings to certain metrics and certain requirements. And we designers produce documentation and hand it to a building official and say, here's how I am promising that I am complying with the code. What we on the enforcement side have not been very good at is the follow-up after the fact to confirm that the building as designed is performing as designed. So we don't know. We frankly have fewer mechanisms and not very effective mechanisms on measuring that. So here's the paradigm shift to Local Law 97. The law is agnostic about how you get there. The law says we're not going to depend on design promises. We are now making requirements for actual measured performance. This is true for and we're taking an even bolder step and saying not just for new construction, this is for everybody, existing buildings as well. And over time, we are going to have to retrofit the lion's share of the buildings in New York City for those buildings to remain within compliance with this local law. So we took a look at, in developing law, we looked at median EUI for buildings across the city, starting with those that already exist. And what's that? We measure our energy consumption already. We've been doing that since 2009. So existing buildings, that median EUI is right there at about 191. And then we compared that to a reference building that's modeled in ASHRAE 90.1, 2010 versus ASHRAE 91.1, 2013. And then what's 25% better than that, or 50% better than the New York City median, and then what's Passive House. We're seeing that Passive House is giving us significantly better performance than any of these other strategies, both in commercial buildings and in multifamily. So now the law has been in place for a bit, and a team was assembled by the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, which is the city's affordable housing agency, Bright Power, the Community Preservation Corporation, Stephen Winter Associates, the Building Energy Exchange, and the Mayor's Office of Sustainability's New York City Accelerator to see what the impacts are economically on this local law and the ways to get at that. So I would encourage you to go check this out. There is a playbook that has come out of this study. It's available online through Building Energy Exchange. And it's cool. It's a very cool playbook. It actually looks at, well, what does this mean? What's this, starts to get at what does this local law mean? They used a couple of control groups. They used a pre-2003 existing building group and a post-2003 construction group based on New York City benchmarking data. These are buildings that already exist and were designed in accordance with existing codes. And then they looked at two passive house study groups, one with with a gas heating system and a group of several projects with electric heat. The findings were interesting, that the passive house group performed significantly better, which we would expect. And we would also expect that the electric heated passive house group performed better than the gas heating. And then if the project was actually passive house certified, that those buildings performed better still. So what does this mean for carbon? And what does this mean for our future? We see that passive house can get us to compliance with local law 97, even out to 2050, when the requirements, the screws have been tightened down a number of times. It gets us passive performance. It's beneficial to the building. It is probably one of those only ways that we're going to get at an envelope, get at this law, by being envelope forward and passive. By definition, we're not using fossil fuels to accomplish this. The study also discovered that essentially all of the passive house buildings can potentially create a carbon, carbon bank account, so to speak. And if carbon trading, if that carbon trading study comes into law and those mechanisms get set up, that building owners may find, if they've gone passive house, that they have an asset in their saved carbon that can be traded and further be of benefit, both in complying with the local law and as an asset and something tangible to sell for the benefit of the property. That's a lot. It's a cool place to be in. I think back to the paradigm shift from design promises to real measured performance is a way we're probably going to go, and we'll probably need to go in all jurisdictions to actually get to the places we need to go. I'm reminded of the architect Chris Benedict and her partner Henry Gifford, who created a little one-act play that they performed before the AIA New York, the local AIA chapter, one time. This little play was called The Perfect Energy Code. And here's Chris, the architect, bringing her drawings and documentation, and is so angst-ridden, and has this audience with the code official, and she's all freaking out about how she's going to demonstrate the energy performance. And the code official just says, "Don't worry about it. It's just a number. Here's your number. Do that." And here we are. It's now the law. So thank you all. Appreciate this. Thanks for having me in this. And I'm going to turn it back to Zach.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. Okay, so that was our second leg of the stool with emissions caps. So now we're going to move to the third, and that is incentives, encouraging early adoption of passive house. So Beverly Craig is going to be presenting. She's the senior program manager at Massachusetts Clean Energy Center's low and moderate income programs. And she has worked on the Passive House Design Challenge for affordable housing, the Affordable Clean Residential Energy Program, and the Triple Decker Design Challenge. She comes from a background of energy efficiency retrofits and installing renewables at nonprofit Homeowners Rehab Incorporated. Bev holds a BA from the University of Southern California and an MPP from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Thank you, Bev.
Thanks, Zach. So I really love this, bringing up the floor, putting on the ceiling, and now here I am talking about incentives, how to reward early adopters. And just thinking back to 2015 in In Pennsylvania, there were no certified passive house multifamily buildings. And through one incentive program, now there are at least 30 multifamilies that are affordable and over 1,000 units. In Massachusetts, in 2015, there was one building, the one that you see on the left here, the distillery, that was a multifamily passive house certified. And now we have 102 buildings, almost 8,000 units, I believe, that are thinking about certifying passive house. So they've at least done passive house energy modeling. So how have incentive programs in those two states made those big changes? And so the first one in Pennsylvania is one that doesn't cost money. And the one in Massachusetts does require some money to incentivize people to go to passive house. But we'll just quickly run through. So I think a lot of you are familiar with Pennsylvania's case. So in this case, affordable housing, it's very competitive to get low-income housing tax credits, which is how you provide the capital to build these new buildings. And so for perspective, I think in Massachusetts, there's about 7 projects for every one that gets funded. So it's very, very competitive. And how they choose is through this scoring ranking system that's called the QAP. You might have heard QAP talked about before. And so in 2015, Pennsylvania, pushed by Tim McDonald, who I think a lot of us know, put 10 bonus points in their QAP. So basically, if you came in with a passive design, you were automatically scoring a lot better than a lot of your peers. And it meant you were going to get funded earlier or maybe in that round. And through that, a number of series of those, they have funded over 30 affordable housing projects over 1,000 units. And the nice thing is the cost per square foot really didn't come in higher. And part of that's because you don't get extra money when you get low income housing tax credits. You have to bring it in. So it's not to say that there weren't any incremental costs. It's that they probably value engineered things out like finishes or maybe landscaping, but it was in a range that they were able to do that. And then we did see a bunch of other states add passive house to the scoring that helped design, pick the different scores. But in going back and looking at which states did that and how they did it, when they made it equivalent to LEED or enterprise green communities, you don't see any projects. So in 12 cases, states added passive house as like the same amount of points as LEED. And I think people are more familiar with LEED and it's not as hard. And so they go with that. They won't go to passive house. So it's only in the states where there was additional points in some way, shape or form. If you go to passive above LEED and there's a differential, that you see passive house projects in the affordable realm that's through low income housing tax credits get built. In Massachusetts, we were one of those states that did not have any incremental benefit as far as low income housing tax credits. We couldn't convince them in our state that it wasn't going to be too expensive. They were very concerned it would be 10%, 15% more expensive, which would mean that they couldn't build as many units. And so the agency that I work for, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and we're a quasi-governmental state agency, we said, well, what can we do? Like, we don't really think it's as expensive as they think. How can we get practitioners started doing this and getting knowledgeable in the state? Because we know early adoption does, the first time you do things, it's harder. And the costs are going to come down as you get more experience. And so we funded a $1.7 million program to reward affordable housing to go in to low-income housing tax credits with a passive design and to build to that standard. So it was up to $4,000 per unit, funded 8 projects, 540 units. And really the goal was to demonstrate that it's really not as expensive as people were thinking. And so here are some of the projects underway. Cambridge Finch, 1.4% incremental cost. And this one actually won FIAS Best Project, I think, last year, and Best Affordable Project. All of these so far are coming in below 3% incremental cost. And we are lucky. I think the Massachusetts stretch code is pretty high to begin with, and affordable housing in the state probably are better on average than most their starting point, because they're going to be a long-term owner. So maybe that's not going to hold for every kind of project in Massachusetts or in every state, but it is encouraging that it's this range, because on projects this size, that kind of premium, the site conditions or the land price or the labor or lumber prices might be as much that up or down. So 9 months after our agency put out this incentive program, the Mass Save program, which is the real big money in the state. So they're the ones who do all the efficiency programs across all the utilities. They seem to like the idea and sort of modeled after our program. And instead of it being $4,000 per unit, it's slightly less generous with $3,000 per unit, but it's for market rate and affordable. And one thing I really like is they picked up some of the, we did ours in several batches. There was pre-construction help, and then some at pre-certification, and then some at the final certification for the $4,000 we proposed. So they did something similar, and they're basically de-risking, trying to figure out whether you should go, convincing the design team whether they should go to passive house or not. So they fund 100% of a passive house feasibility study up to $5,000. 75% of passive house modeling costs up to $20,000. And then when you actually certify, you get $3,000 per unit. And another thing I like is if you don't actually hit passive, say at the very last minute, you have to value engineer out triple glazed windows or something happens, you still get double the new construction incentive that's based on like greenhouse or BTUs saved. And so this is like the hockey stick of adoption. So, you know, almost nothing in the state to now we have over 102 projects signed up to at least do the passive house modeling. So we're not exactly sure how many of those will actually certify, but it's encouraging to even see them doing that modeling because I think it adds something. They don't usually focus on airtightness to the same degree or thermal bridging. And so it sort of opens the eyes, I think, of the design team. And we're hoping that a big portion do go for it. So that's sort of our story of incentives. The Pennsylvania case doesn't cost anything. The Massachusetts case does. We hope to continue this program under Mass Save for a number of more years until this sort of becomes industry practice. And we definitely do see examples of where costs are coming down, and we're finding tricks and ways of approaching things so that it becomes less expensive. So I do think the incremental cost will come down later. And I will say, so some of these other approaches, the pulling up the floor, at the same time that these incentives have been offered, we've had some other things in the state that have been pushing at the same time that are probably part of the reason that we're having so much adoption so quickly. One of it's that larger projects in the state do trigger an environmental impact statement. And the Department of Energy Resources, which looks over those, has been really pushing folks who trigger that are doing multifamily to go to passive. So you have a little bit of a stick of bringing up the floor with that, then this incentive being provided. And then we were successful in getting 2 additional points above lead in the last round of low-income housing tax credits. So 6 of the projects just awarded all went passive, which I think is about 2/3 of the new construction and affordable. So very encouraging. But I love all these ideas from different takes, and it's great to see them all coming together in some ways. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you, Bev. Really impressive. It's great to see this graph. So we've touched on the three-legged stool. So now we're going to pivot to Prudence Ferreira, who is going to talk about a tool that is on the horizon that could be helpful to all 3 approaches to policy. Prudence is co-host of Passive House Accelerator's Global Passive House Happy Hour and has been a passive house and building science consultant, CPHC curriculum developer and trainer, and FIAS board member for over a decade. She recently joined BR+A Consulting Engineers as a senior member of their sustainable design group and the firm's passive house practice lead. She's a founding member of the FIAS Technical Committee, a current member of the ASHRAE 227 Standard Committee, and she's consulted on more than 50 passive house projects across 7 different climate zones and has experience with unique passive house typologies such as curtain wall tower, historic masonry retrofit, medical facilities, labs, and senior housing. So Prudence, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Zach. Thank you, all of you people who are out there making this happen on the policy front. I am also really encouraged and hopeful to hear about everything that's happening. And I'm excited to share with you guys what's happening with ASHRAE 227. So just starting with some context, zooming back out to illustrate the three legs of the stool in the US coming carbon regulations that are driving zero net energy codes for new construction. We all know that achieving at least net zero ready is one of the fastest ways to decarbonize the built environment, take the pressure off the grid so that it can transition to more renewable production. And we also all know that every new building that's not net zero ready, at least, is soon going to be huge liability for our owners and society as a whole. And we just don't have the time or resources to retrofit buildings we design today in 20 or 30 years. And then also the retrofit standards are coming. We have leaders there. You know, and we've heard from our friends at NYSERDA that we need 9,406 retrofits per day or 783 retrofits per hour to meet those 2050 zero emissions goals in the US alone. And carbon limits are being put in place for existing buildings across the US, not just in New York, although they are leading the way. Massachusetts is close behind, California is leading the way, Washington. And there's also policy around cleaning up the electric grid. As of September 2019, Maine, New York, California, Hawaii, Nevada, New Mexico, Washington, and DC have requirements for 100% clean electricity by 2050. But we need all three legs of the stool ground and support us in achieving climate action and ultimately climate justice. And while there are many jurisdictions at all levels leading the way, there are more that don't yet have a plan. And we need all of our communities to have access to a reference standard that gets the balance right and clearly lays out the most effective path to reduce operational carbon emissions for the life cycle of a building. And that starts with envelope efficiency first. So optimizing investment in envelope to the point of diminishing returns with backstops for comfort, resilience, and durability leads to the greatest emission reductions at the lowest construction cost premium due to reduced mechanical and renewable resource costs. We know this. This is basic passive house tunneling through cost barrier stuff with the highest life cycle savings. And this logic, the logic of this approach is so sound that it actually forms the core of the new ASHRAE 227 standard, which ultimately is a standard focused on zero emissions goals with all the best of passive house baked inside. That includes the collaborative expertise of the brightest minds at FIAS, PHI, and ASHRAE. Here's a long-term care facility where we can actually see that principle at work in a new trend I'm starting. Others have probably been starting it concurrently of incorporating carbon into our life cycle analysis now on every project, period. So the passive house path to net zero results in 33% greater emissions reductions than the most efficient non-passive house path. And at a net present savings of more than 2 million just for 20 years, this is only 20 years, not even 40, effectively meeting 2040 emissions goals today with less renewable resources needed, no emissions fees within that 20-year time frame. And of course, we need to get to zero with no emissions fees for the life cycle of the building, but look at the passive house option down there. It's already all the way down at 4 kilograms per CO2 equivalent per square foot without renewables, right? Without renewables. And you can see in Massachusetts, at least in Boston, that cost for alternative compliance payments, you know, it's not quite as high as in New York City, but it's at $234 per. So, you know, that adds up in the other non-passive house options. So really the purpose is to take the best of what we know how to do, which is passive house, and take the best of what ASHRAE is developing because they keep pushing the standards forward and bake that into a two-model approach. We've got a baseline model, but the baseline model is passive house. It's got all the passive house best practices baked into it. And then you have a proposed model that you can use that must be at least as good as your baseline, but allows for some trade-offs. And so right now, the first draft of the standard is in process, and our next committee meeting, all of our working groups are going to share their draft language with the main committee. Our working groups are organized around the passive house principles. We've got all of these passive house principles in the space conditioning working group that you see here. In our supportive requirements working group, we've got thermal bridges, moisture management, ventilation. And then we also have an air tightness working group. And then lastly, an energy and carbon working group that not only looks at system performance and what metrics that we're going to be looking towards ultimately, but looks out beyond. And there's been a lot of collegial cross-pollination with folks on various ASHRAE committees so that we can all align. And even ASHRAE itself is turning towards carbon metrics. Even 90.1 is turning towards carbon metrics. So ASHRAE 227 is going to align with ASHRAE 228 for definitions of zero energy, zero carbon, how on-site, off-site, and renewable energy certificates are treated. It also will align with the newest versions of ASHRAE 62 for ventilation, 55 for comfort, 160 for moisture, as well as current Passive House ISO and EN reference standards. And the great thing about it is that it's allowing flexibility or agnosticism in terms of using either future-looking source energy per NREL data, PHI's PER approach, FIA's source energy, or any other hourly emissions data, national, regional, or local that a jurisdiction cares to apply to it. So it's flexible. It also expands access and reduce barriers to adoption by allowing all new and existing construction to adopt the rigorous building science that is Passive House without forcing authorities having jurisdiction to go through our existing certification bodies alone. Also, it's expanding access by opening up compliance modeling to any ASHRAE 140 validated software tool, as long as you use the same software for target setting model and your proposed model. So that means free open source software tools like Energy Plus and the whole Grasshopper Ladybug tools environment, as well as eQuest, IAS, PHPP, Woofy Passive, all of it. It's all going to be able to come into play. And with new advanced web-based tools and graphical user interfaces in development with open APIs, an increasing need for data-driven decision-making, as everyone needs to get to those decisions faster, and they're not Passive House experts like we are. Flexibility is really important, and the use of big data is really important. Ultimately, by using ASHRAE 227, which is consensus-based, extremely flexible and software agnostic, we can also increase access to the best practices in cost-effective carbon neutral design for designers that simply don't have time to reinvent the wheel. And together, developments in progressive standards and open source tools will empower our whole industry and those seeking to join us in increasing the velocity and effectiveness of our climate action. Now, in terms of equity and accessibility, ASHRAE 227 is using a consensus process to crystallize and simplify Passive House technical expertise, but any reference standards need to be consensus-based. Now, while the committee itself is largely Caucasian people that most we would consider to be privileged, the standard is open to public comment, and a first draft is due out this fall. And we are first relying on all of you to read and comment. And then my hope is ultimately that our community will also take 227 to local groups to educate and get feedback. So instead of the rooms being all white, like we're looking at in this picture, of adopting a net zero code for Massachusetts, we get feedback from diverse rooms with diverse faces, diverse backgrounds and perspectives that can take something like 227 and make it their own, add to it, add to the ready-made bake mix, add the blueberries, the chocolate chips, the frosting, the sprinkles, whatever you want, and use it as a springboard for climate justice. Thank you guys for listening. And I'm hopeful for your participation as we move this thing forward.
Thank you, Prudence. Whew. All right, Bomi, we'd love to hand it to you now and kind of tie things together and just take it away. Where do you want to take this conversation? I'm
just reeling at like how much information that was. It was fantastic, so comprehensive, so much information. So I want to get back to. So I want to make a couple of observations, and then get back to where I started from with this tonight. So Prudence, I am not a Passive House expert. I'm just an affordable housing person, I guess. I'm a groupie. How about that? I'm a passive house groupie. And I think that, even though I've been listening to, conversations around certainly incentives quite a bit, codes somewhat for a number of years, I have to say that just even as a person who's in the real estate industry, this is all very geeky, wonderfully geeky, but geeky nonetheless. And I think, this forum here with all of you is fantastic in that obviously as professionals, you're sharing information. But I do think that, this idea that, somehow, the codes being open to public, having open public comment periods, is certainly, it's a first step, right? And I think that one of the things that's been a thread through all of the presentations has been a placement of affordable housing as if you want to think about it as a benefit for communities that have had this investment historically. Affordable housing being the front of the line certainly is positive. But I do want to sort of go back and ask this question about, sharing that decision-making power, right? Because I think that, as a professional person, it's a very scary thing to contemplate when we talk about sharing power, right? Because we all spent years, we have academic training in their subject areas, we've built our careers doing these very wonderfully geeky things. And I think it is sort of on a sort of individual by individual basis, a difficult thing to contemplate. And so when we were prepping for tonight, one of the ideas that came up in conversation was sort of, maybe we start by being more mindful about engaging communities that haven't traditionally had a voice at these tables, and whether that is BIPOC colleagues within the real estate and A&E field, or whether that's grassroots organizations. Maybe we have a 10% challenge in our industry to say we're going to spend 10% of our professional attention on climate justice. So whether that's within our firm, within, in the relationships that we're building outside the firm, whether it's in supporting community organizations with technical knowledge that they wouldn't otherwise have access to, let's do something proactive within our firms to say, we're actually going to carve out time, right? Time that's, that's valuable for all of us, carve out time to actually spend the time figuring out how do we think about climate justice. So with that proposal on the table, I'd like to ask the speakers, whoever wants to respond, where do you see the opportunity to center climate justice in building performance policy, right? So we've talked a little bit about workforce development. We've certainly talked about, we can talk about inclusion and diversity at the workplace. We've talked about, benefiting low-income folks in our programmatic design. But what hasn't come up that you feel like, we should think about as a profession to center climate justice in building performance policy?
Well, in the conversations leading up to the summit, one of the things that came up that really hit home to me was a conversation we had about not just doing outreach as kind of, carrying out the passive house message, but going and engaging with local organizations and underserved communities and listening, simply listening and finding out what it is they're struggling with and what they need. And then thinking about how we as a community might have something to offer them, but first listening and really understanding what their world is like, right? Because if we just go out and just try to push stuff out on them without taking that time, that's intrusionary. It's coming from a place thinking something, and I don't see that as being the whole picture of how that we can support this sort of decision making and power sharing.
That's a really good point. I think also because of the whole, language thing, right? So part of this, the wonderful geekiness here, the language is specific because it is technical, but it also makes it less accessible. So even if you're inviting someone at the table, they still have to learn this whole language that, that we all speak as professionals. If you're going out to an organization, you have to learn their language, right? That's great. Thank you.
Well, getting at, in getting at what people need in terms of listening. And I totally agree with that point, because I'll do that better. How do we frame this in a way that's more universally communicative? And what keeps coming up for me, and this is being turning into my own professional mantra, is the idea is survival in our buildings, right? That we do all this code stuff, but at the end of the day, it's about our physical survival. Survival to me is the new green, and it's just as plain as that. And we could go to Red Hook houses and ask the folks there who felt, experienced Sandy in the most intense way possible, or what do they need, and they want to survive. They want to be able to stay in their homes. If we have the technology now, and we have the ability that our 90-year-old grandmothers can stay in their assisted living or their affordable housing accommodations when the power goes off, and there's a climate shock that brings the temperature up into the 90s to 100 degrees and 90% humidity. And if my 90-year-old grandma can't stay in her apartment there, for 10 days or whatever climate event, whatever design event that is, then in my opinion, we haven't done enough. And I think that's some fundamental listening, is we're truly talking about our survival.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I mean, and I think what you're also sort of saying, or that I hear you saying, is, as professionals, we all believe that this is the best way to build for reasons that, we often don't, we don't need to articulate it to each other because we all kind of agree, right? But that doesn't mean that everybody else outside of the industry, hears all of that packed into that the language that we use.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. I was just.
You go ahead, Anthony. I already blabbed.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about embodied carbon is it's relatively new to a lot of people. So there's actually a lot of opportunity, I think, to bring this conversation to many different groups. Like now I'm kind of putting on my Carbon Leadership Forum, like CLF Vancouver hat, where we're trying to engage a lot of, different design professionals and just other people that are in the industry. But what I'm seeing is that especially like a lot of young people within a large design firm, like they're taking a big interest in this, and they're kind of becoming, just by kind of diving deeper into this topic, they've kind of become the internal champion within the company. And then they actually help push a lot of these initiatives internally, and they kind of elevate in their leadership. And so I see that as one of the other opportunities is, through these kind of informal knowledge sharing network type events. And also, we may get into developing training or other capacity building efforts that can really empower a lot of people to kind of elevate in their leadership, and also to kind of bring their voices in giving them an opportunity where they may not have had that opportunity in other fields where there's already lots of experts, and there's, a lot of, they may be more intimidated in that way. So that's just something that I see.
Anthony, I feel like you're implying that there's a connection here with sort of inclusion in the workplace. Is that is that part of what you're saying here also?
Yeah. And just, I mean, I think this is something that, well, how do I say it? I think there's an opportunity to create a lot more opportunities, especially for people that are kind of younger or maybe like just less experienced in the field, because like there's so few people in most firms that are kind of focused on this. And so if we as an organization, like I'm speaking like as CLF Vancouver, for example, if we can engage a much wider community of people, this actually creates a lot of opportunities for them that may not have been available otherwise.
The thing that I was going to say before was kids, right? Like some of us are getting involved in teaching kids about building science. And if we can get the kids excited about it, it's not hard to really talk to any people and make it meaningful to them, no matter what their background is or where they're coming from. And I think that aligns somewhat with what you're saying too, Anthony, like in terms of diversifying and giving people a way to plug into taking climate action in their community and understanding what those tools are and what the basics of it is.
I think there's also something to be said about a distinction just between, I mean, obviously getting on the same page and being able to communicate is really super important, right? But I do think that there's also something to be, and I don't know, I don't have answers, I just have questions. But I think there is something to be said about, like, at what point does that really lead to sort of co-creation and really that power sharing piece, right? I mean, and I think that's why we really just need to, carve out some time to think about it, because I don't know that, I mean, maybe there's a magical person who has an answer out there, but I don't know who that is. So
I've got some thoughts on this, Bomi. I think of the success that we've had overall in BC with the step code. It's all based on relationships. And I'm not a technical person at all. I'm a relationship management is my background. And I wasn't originally allowed, I wasn't invited to sit at the table because it was meant to be a technical exercise, but I came in and listened, and I wasn't allowed to speak, which was really good because I forced me to listen and just to see the dynamics of what was going on in the room. And then when I saw people who were like looking like not keen on some of the points that were being made, I would go for lunch with them or chat and find out what was happening for them around the table. And then that allowed us to me to identify, okay, well, man, this is a person, an advocate, or this is a sticking point. Like, nobody's against climate action around our table. It was all about, they had concerns around, affordability issues or technical training, etc. So it's taking the time to build that relationship. And when you talk about the 10% effort, I'd put like 8% of that into relationship building, of mapping out, doing power mapping around who is it that we need to bring into this space, and then intentionally connecting with people and having those conversations. We've been doing this within our group. We have an Indigenous group with a relationship manager, and initially it was like, oh great, well, wouldn't it be awesome if all these Indigenous communities could reference the step code in their building standards. And once you actually reach out and talk to these communities, man, that is the last place they want to start. They have got health and safety issues with these buildings. And so we really worked hard on understanding how we can help with immediate issues. And now we're getting, and opportunistically out to new construction standards. But I think it's approaching the issue with humility, and this is something that we can all learn, and everyone's got something to bring into the pie. And also using the language. It was really important to me. I always got confused by like ASHRAE when 19 whatever, but I get boggled quite easily, and I think other people who are non-technical get that too. So that's why we try to make, like, I'm not technical, but I know that 2's better than 1 and 5's the top. I get it, like where we might be going. So I think putting together a lexicon and a language that's clear and it goes with some humility and tries to meet people where they're at.
yeah, thank you.
Well, it's interesting on incentives too. So a lot of, I don't know if this is true across the country, but the funding that comes to our agency and that funds Mass Save is a systems benefit charge. It's basically a tax on everybody's electricity or gas or whatever. And there's a big equity issue about where that money is spent right now. And I'm pleased to see a lot of this on the passive house side being like in the affordable realm first. But way too much advertising has been going on for single family homes. And I think Prudence, when she was talking about more diverse voices being at the table, that was through the sort of planning process for how to spend that money. And there was a real concerted effort to bring more people to the table and to make it a way for them to communicate goals and needs and possible solutions. And so I think that the money side of things is important as well.
Mike, I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you want to?
I appreciate that, Bomi, but I don't know. It's a difficult question.
Absolutely.
We're not going to get anywhere with if we don't try. So, and I reflect on my own work. Whatever we can do to help. You said that 10% and of time. Something needs to push us. I look at even all of the work I've done, like every code piece I've done, somehow like starts while I used to work for utility whatever, 2011 to 14, I had a 2-hour commute, and an outcome-based energy budget code proposal came out of all the time I spent on the bus. And trying to find time is if we can somehow mesh time commitment with what you're talking about, we can accomplish something. But it's like for professionals myself, the getting over that hurdle of, we have the desire, and it's like how we want Passive House in there. We also want equity, climate justice to happen. And
Yeah,
we haven't figured it out, but we're not going to stop trying.
right. Well, we had 1% for art. Google has the 20%. Like, I forget what they're called, the Google project time. Like, pursue your own innovations or whatever on Google's time. I mean, I guess so. So if you're a principal of your firm out there and you're listening to this, I would love to hear whether you feel like you could adopt something like a 10% challenge in your firm. I'd love to hear that. Send it to Zach.
Yes, please do. And I think we want to take up this challenge at the Accelerator, and in a number of ways. And if for folks, not only I'd love to hear your stories, and we'd love to hear your stories, but also I want to. We need to be thinking about how we can engage as a community more and more in centering equity in our work, and a lot of that has to do with learning, and a lot of it has to do with networks and relationships. I think I totally agree with Robin. So if you are interested in working with us on this, I also would love to hear from you. So my email is Zach, Z-A-C-K, at passivehouseaccelerator.com. And we'll be, taking more steps to make progress in this area. As we accelerate Passive House, we want to also accelerate equity in this transition to better buildings. So let's, please help. So Bomi, is there anything more that you want to explore now, or should we move to other questions? Where are you at?
Oh yeah, please. Let's move to other questions.
Okay, cool. We have a ton, and thank you for all these great questions. And I don't know where to start. There's no way we're going to get through everything. Not even close. We have 15 minutes left here, 13 minutes left. So let's see. I will start with, so Bronwyn had a question, Bronwyn Berry. This is for Robin. How did the idea for setting an end goal and then backcasting originate? Actually, Bronwyn, can you ask your question? I'm violating the principle here of Accelerator Q&A.
I was kind of enjoying that, because I
don't know what I was doing.
I've asked a ton of questions. Yeah, you got the gist of it. Really, just the whole framing of the BC Step Code is so ingenious, because it actually sets a final end goal, which is what I've always struggled. I'm constantly telling policymakers, just tell us where the hell you want us to go, and stop, for God's sakes, the hamster wheel. We're tired of it. And, ironically, I'm hearing all these policymakers and all these plan checkers and all these city folks, they can't keep up with the constant cycle either. And it's really the essence of what I see is keeping our building industry from actually delivering good buildings. It's just too in flux. There's no stability. So Robin, really, where did that framing? It's so simple, but how did you guys get that into the BC Step Code structure, and how can we get that into every other code structure?
Bronwyn, a great question, and you've won Zoom. That is a gorgeous background you got there. You must be an architect or something. Yeah, I agree completely with you. I think it came to a point of frustration that there was so many different references. So we'd worked with local governments to be able to, we co-fund positions within local government. And so they were looking at every opportunity to be able to push above code buildings. So that was rezonings or building permit rebates or their own construction, etc. And it just was such a morass of where they wanted to point to. And I didn't know what to tell them. Like, should it be built green? Should it be a LEED? And people would point to LEED, and then LEED would be like really ticked that they were referring to LEED without actually requiring the qualification, etc. So it was a real mess here back in 2015, 2016. And the industry actually came down and said to governments, stop local governments from going nuts here. Like, it's super complicated and confusing. So the Building Act came down in BC, and local governments got told, you cannot require anything above code. And then local governments were like, what? Like, you're asking us to be climate action partners. At least give us some clarity. We're all about consistency. That's fine, but what should we be referring to? And so this idea of this, this stepped approach that was articulated in the white paper was really helpful, because then we can all get behind it, and we can do costing behind it. We can do it for different building types. So I think it's really been magical. And the big secret, though, is to commit to cranking up the code. At a federal level, we're looking at a national tier code, and they're looking, I think, to make it optional. Now, that's no good. Like, that's just basically the same as what we've got at the moment. Like, anybody could build a passive house or LEED or whatever. The fact that we're signposting that the code will change, that the base code will change, is the critical bit. And for builders to believe that, so it's worth investing, or manufacturers to invest in that equipment, because they know that that's going to happen. So that was a bit of the genesis.
Brilliant, thank you. And as you can see, your market, your products are actually getting delivered now to Passive House, and that's hasn't happened in the US yet. So I think that's really showing policy that, setting the end goal and making it clear is where we, that's just the mechanism, and all the metrics get to be, negotiated, right? So love it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn. So Paul T and Laura B, are you still on the line or on the Zoom? I will ask your question.
I see
Okay.
them.
Yeah, we're here.
No, we're here.
Great. Can you ask your question about refrigerants?
One of the questions was,
This is the refrigerants.
yes, there was the calculation of the greenhouse gas emissions, and of course heat pumps were very low, but we wanted to know, did they include refrigerant in that calculation?
Yeah, as a background, at the Washington, was a Theist conference in Washington a couple of years ago. I saw a presentation, and this fellow, I wish I would remember his name, and he was talking about refrigerants and the carbon load, and what happens when you recharge your refrigerant after you've installed your VRF, and the fact that if you have to recharge it, you've just lost some big percentage of the operational carbon that you were saving by having this super energy efficient building. And that really just blew my mind, that concept, that there goes all that carbon right into the air. So the question is refrigerants included in operational carbon or embodied carbon, or is it
Missing.
I can speak to that. So actually in the City of Vancouver's rezoning policy, they actually do require quantifying the emissions from refrigerants, and they have some standard assumptions for leakage rates. This is one of the notoriously difficult parts, is like, what is the leakage rate? And we don't have really great data on that. There's lots of different studies, and for different system types, there's different numbers that get thrown out, 2%, 10% annual leakage, who knows where it's at. So that's one of the challenges. But yes, like you mentioned, the refrigerants are hugely impactful because they're thousands of times more impactful global warming potential compared to CO2, right? So small releases of these gases can be quite significant. And actually, Integral Group published a really great report on refrigerant management. So if you check that out, they have a refrigerant management best practices guide. But yeah, a lot of this is a function of how much refrigerant charge there is and how much of it gets leaked out. I think technically it should belong in the operational domain because it kind of ties in with the mechanical equipment and whatnot. But sometimes you can think of it as embodied emissions. I don't know. It doesn't matter which category you put it in, so to speak. It just matters that you actually address it as well. So quantify it somewhere.
Where was it in that chart?
I think oftentimes it does get neglected. I think it's something that does need to be put in, and it depends on who's requiring it and where they technically put it in. I think in Vancouver, they're likely going to put it mainly in the operational bucket. That's my understanding, at least.
All right, great, thank you.
Awesome. Michael Bobker, are you on still? I had a question about providing state incentives for things that are required by law.
I'm Michael Cox. I'm not sure if I had a question similar to that, so maybe
Okay.
it was me.
Fire away, Michael.
No, it was really a knee-jerk response to Tom's presentation, and thinking about all of that cash that's going in a bucket somewhere from the fines that are being levied against buildings that are non-compliant, and then him revealing that public housing had to be carved out of it for whatever reasons. They couldn't do it, and it just seemed odd to me that that money couldn't be used to bring the least of the bunch up to some level of compliance or comfort with the rest of us. When we talk about equity and so on, that's often the least advantaged get left behind through no fault of their own. And that might be, in a naive way, a way of ameliorating it.
I'd like to just jump in on just a little factual thing. So obviously, I'm not speaking for the New York City Housing Authority, but the New York City Housing Authority is not carved out of Local Law 97. The Housing Authority has to meet basically the same greenhouse gas ceilings as private buildings, but the requirements are structured a little differently. But it's actually, in a way, the requirement on public housing is actually a little bit broader, because it's not, so the carbon limits don't apply to just the large buildings. That applies to all affordable housing, all public housing that's either owned by NYCHA or on NYCHA land. So even private buildings that are on NYCHA owned land fall under the NYCHA umbrella. So for example, there may be affordable housing buildings that wouldn't have made the cut as under the affordable housing program, that would have used the prescriptive path, but they're now actually under the NYCHA umbrella. So they actually have to do a more of a performance oriented program. And so, I mean, it's in some ways a little bit confusing, because there is sort of like this, there's, affordable housing, there's private buildings, and then there's this like, third bucket that's quite different for public housing. But I did want to make the point that the law doesn't carve out public housing.
Yeah. Sorry, Bummy. Thank you.
Particularly confusing from a leftover hippie sitting in the middle of Brandon, Manitoba, in the middle of Canada.
Yeah. Well,
well, we actually have a plan. We have a plan for NYCHA. I have to. I'm so recently not NYCHA that I have to stop, get myself out of the habit of saying we. But NYCHA has a plan for Local Law 97 that goes out, sort of conceptually through to 2050. So
yeah, it's the misrepresentation. Thank you for clarifying that, Bummy. It's that rather than being on an individual building level, it's program wide, so that's a percentage. So there's still requirements to meet the GHG targets, but it's done in the aggregate rather than individual buildings. That's one thing. And then Michael Cox, to talk to you briefly about where's all that money going from the fines. That's just sort of in the making of the sausage and creating of the local law. That was something that got kind of agonized over for a good while. It's like several years worth of discussion about, well, okay, if we create if you create an enforcement mechanism that includes monetary penalties, does that money just go back into the city's coffers, or can it be, can we create basically like a retrofit bank, to coin a term, where that money gets earmarked specifically for assisting folks in getting over that hurdle and coming into compliance? There's no actual mechanism that made it into the law at this point. It's still a concept that's I'm being bandied about. So it's one of those things. It's like, stay tuned and see if somebody figures out a magic mechanism that we can, where a law can be written and that money can be earmarked. That'd be a great thing. We just didn't get to that point yet.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Michael. So I'm going to spring this on the panelists real quick. We didn't talk about this, so that we'll see how people think on their feet. We have 1 minute left. So, and this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so appreciative of all the panelists and everybody who's been here. So, could each panelist just leave one parting thought for the audience? One last thing you'd like folks on the call to hear from you about policy, maybe what they can do to move the needle, or you know, center equity, or you name it. And I'll leave the floor open here for the panelists to share.
Listen to
Right.
all your stakeholders and make your voices heard.
I'd say get involved. Like Passive House was a massive benefit for us at pushing the conversation. Like we have people on, you know, people who are less desirable to see these changes on one end. So holding that conversation, being involved in committees, understanding how codes gets developed within your jurisdiction, and, you know, putting the time in to build those relationships.
Oh, I have one more. We have to future-proof everything we design and construct, because anything designed to code is a failure, because we already know that the future requirements are going to be more stringent and the future needs are more stringent. So everything you do should be future-proofing what you design and construct.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Robin.
I can speak. For embodied carbon, I think the most important thing is policy. Like, people have been doing LCAs for like decade plus, but it never hit mainstream until locally in Vancouver, until it actually made it into the rezoning requirement. So I think if you have the ears of any city policy official, like really, I'm going to send a link here, embodiedcarbonpolicies.com. That's a great collection of 52 different policy items. I think like that's the most important thing. If you can get that, that's how the market's going to move. It's not going to happen through voluntary mandates and whatnot, and doing it at the whole building level. So that's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony.
Toss out, find partners and allies. Again, back to our Shift Zero in the Washington State, how that group has brought 45 different organizations with different strengths. So folks have strengths in a specific area, can go push in that area, and others can support. It just helps build strength. And the last quote, I'll leave a quote from that I heard Cory Booker, Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, say it, that if you're told no, it doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you have to keep looking for another partner.
I definitely second what Mike says in terms of looking for partners and starting grassroots. The folks that I'm working for now, they did this amazing thing in Massachusetts where they went to all the architects and the engineering firms and said, do you guys think we can do net zero? We know how to do this now, right? They got like that picture that I showed you guys was literally like a list of all of these professional organizations that came in support of a net zero code, saying we could do this now, we know how to do this now, and brought it to the body that was making decisions, to the effect that the body said, we don't want your props in your silly list, bring us a proposal, bring us the language, right? So grassroots and sharing resources. Don't hog it, just share it as widely as you can.
Awesome. Thanks, Prudence.
People seem to think policy is boring or dry. It's not. It's about building community. It's about all getting together and suggesting solutions. And we've talked about a ton of possible options for solutions. Policymakers want to hear that. So collect your partners, bring a lot of people, and go for it.
Right. Thanks, Beth.
I'm going to go with I want to ask everybody to like mantra this when you're doing your yoga practice or whatever, right? Like it's free as in speech, not as in beer.
Well said. Well said. Fantastic. Thanks, Bomi. And I wish, that said, I wish we could all get together for beer right now. But this is really wonderful. Thank you, everybody. We will have the recording of this available on the Passive House Accelerator website, so you can share this. And looking forward to the next one. Everyone, be well and